Good afternoon, everyone. It's Alphie and Alain again after a very long break. It's been almost a month, hasn't it? 3 weeks?
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
Anyway, we are now going to go into an exploration of madness. And it'll be a continuation over a few weeks of ideas that we're going to explore. Today, and probably over the coming weeks as well, we'll be looking at the works of Anna Kavan. We've mentioned her before. Now, Anna Kavan, I'm not going to go into too much detail now because it's a very long, detailed, descriptive growth of work. So once I start, I never get out of it. Anna Kavan was born in 1901 in Cannes, and she died in 1968 in London, in a house, and in a very posh part of London. When her body was discovered, she was holding what she called a bazooka, and the bazooka was a syringe that was full of heroin, because Anna Kavan is an addict, and she was an addict for all of her adult life. And over the weeks we'll begin to uncover what this life was. It was very tragic, actually. Just very briefly, when she was born, she was immediately sent over to London to be raised by a nurse. She rarely saw a mother and father, but her father committed suicide and jumped off a boat. And that was the beginning of various events in her life that led to Anna Kavan becoming what I think is one of the great English writers whose work has never really been appreciated. And I think one of the reasons for that is because she writes about madness, addiction and terror, and she's writing about herself all the time. So in a moment I'll hand over to Alain, who's going to read the introduction, very small introduction, from a series of stories from a collection of work called Julia and the Bazooka. Alain.
If it is possible to concentrate the nature of a person's life into a brief sketch, then that of Anna Kavan is conveyed perfectly in the story which closes this selection of autobiographical pieces. Julia and the Bazooka seems to me a most symmetrical example of the art by which this obdurately subjective writer chose elements of her life and transformed them into something rich and strange and basically true. Written a year or so before her death in 1968, in a sense she even foresaw her end in this story, although a wartime bomb destroys Julia. This is her syringe. Her bazooka, she always called it, the doctor says with a sad smile. A syringe lay in Anna Kavan's hand when she was found dead in her London home, a shot of the heroin to which she had been accustomed for some 30 years still inside the plastic barrel. Her palliative had not obliterated the last moment. Her drug addiction is helpful to an understanding of these stories and much of Anna Kavan's other work, especially her superbly composed book, A Silent Piece. Perhaps some inkling of the reason why a person begins to take drugs can be traced in these stories. This apart, it strikes me that the collection can be seen either as an over-idiosyncratic personal document or as a moving chronicle of terrifying isolation and defeat. Under the daily stimulus and pacifications of heroin and the amphetamines, Anna Kavan wrote with ceaseless productivity. Was her bazooka a salvation for her? She lived until she was 67. Had the bazooka kept tuberculosis at bay? She married twice, bore a son, and was divorced twice. She travelled and lived in many parts of the world, bred bulldogs whilst gracing the Chilterns with a painter husband, and for a time worked as editorial assistant on a literary magazine. Later, she profitably renovated old London houses, launching a limited company for this. She also painted bizarre studies of tormented women and, occasionally, men. Work did not stop at the end, and only writing really mattered. She wrote in a mirror. It imprisoned her. Watching only herself, her men are wraiths, and nearly always treacherous, as perhaps shadows must be. Retreat from an intolerable world was to become more and more a necessity. When, 10 years before she died, she retained sufficient of her excellent constructive energy to design herself a house, battling knowledgeably with architects and builders, she was to keep its Venetian blinds down all day, and her small walled garden was secret, a density of foliage, such as her favourite Henri Rousseau might have painted, a dream leopard prowling under the lunar green fronds. In the world of reality, her social conduct was apt to become erratic, passing too swiftly from the most delicate perception of a guest's mood to hurling a roast fowl across the table at him, then retiring to her bazooka and shortly afterwards be discovered on her bed, reading a novel and eating chocolates out of a box. But another self could view the bazooka from an objective distance, and a wry joke would be cracked about it. The discipline that sustained writing entails was helpful, as probably a respect for the principles of creative work, surely it is manifest in these stories, helped to keep under control the lying that becomes a nuisance in confirmed drug addicts. That other self carried, too, a sense of guilt. There was also an unfaltering love and knowledge of the Bible. Over the decades, this writer changed her identity more than once, together with her always elegant physical appearance. As Helen Ferguson, she published several conventional home counties novels in the 20s and 30s. Then Kafka's work was found to contain the modern scriptures, and her own nightmares set down in writing became less an intangible horror. She was not one to heed the aphorism of S.J. Lech, the Polish poet, "Don't tell your dreams. What if the Freudians come to power?" She became Anna Kavan by deed poll, and after a period spent in a mental hospital, at a time when she became a registered drug addict and almost unrecognisably spectral in appearance, she published under this name in 1940 the much-praised series of sketches, Asylum Piece. The truth of that book, a pioneering work in its intuitive depiction of clinical states of mind, captured in this case from the inside of a lost identity, is the truth of a subjective vision such as runs in the present collection. It was not until after publication of Asylum Piece that I, who had first met Anna Kavan in happy circumstances, became aware of the drug addiction from which much of her writing was to derive its symbolic, visionary, and above all despairing elements. She could not escape from the evil of hopelessness. It would arrive at any ordinary moment. Sitting with her in the Café Royal, I found her taking an extraordinary dislike to a waiter, who certainly was repellent physically, but otherwise, to my eye, harmless. It was with astonishment that I was to find the episode transformed an Asylum Piece. I had not understood that her brief flight from the restaurant table was done to give herself a shot of heroin, after which she gained detachment from the oppressive hovering of the waiter who, as related in the book, had indeed followed us from the bar upstairs to serve us in the restaurant below, which for her had become pursuit by one of the menacing devils threatening her security. The waiter was in some way connected with a hallucinatory figure awaiting her in the foyer. The title of one of her stories in I Am Lazarus, published in 1945, was another early portent. All kinds of grief shall arrive. Although she was less subjective in that collection, bomb explosions in the pages are not so much a wartime phenomenon as echoes of personal assaults and the destruction of human repose, which is the real meaning of war in its inescapable aftermaths. Everybody becomes a neurotic, and no hope can be admitted. Soon her writing attempted to chart apocalyptic chaos, especially in such a novel as Ice, with its vision of global destruction from closing walls of ice. She placed the background of novels and stories in an anonymous country where the vast, implacable forces, while remaining impersonal, were yet always inimical to man, more particularly to a lost girl searching for an impossible security. The stories in the present book are chosen from among many other manuscripts as representative of not only of Anna Kavan's art, but her life. She is in each. But the wealthy mother, on whom she blamed so much of her unhappiness, is now only a fugitive reflection in the mirror. Overridingly, Anna Kavan's retreat from the realistic, the tamed, the domestic world is here. In World of Heroes, she asks, "What could have been done to make me afraid to grow up out of such a childhood?" Later on, I saw things more in proportion. I was always afraid of falling back into that ghastly black isolation of an uncomprehending, solitary, oversensitive child. The only escape is speeding in a high-powered car. Its metal body surrounds me like magic armor, inside which I'm invulnerable. The high-powered car was really a bazooka. Since she lived until she was 67, it could not be called a killer. But she attempted suicide twice, as there were dramas resulting from overdoses. In moments of acute depression, she admitted to grief that she had ever taken to drugs. Invulnerability was a mirage. A period for treatment in a withdrawal clinic was useless, as was her close knowledge of psychiatry. Her long friendship with a devoted poetry-writing doctor helped. After his death, a search for another doctor was one of her bitter pilgrimages. She experienced a shunning of drug addicts by the National Health hard workers, who have as much right as anybody else to refuse the discomfort of a halo. But she did not stop writing. In addition, every aid that another kind of art can provide was, to the end, lavished on her scrupulous personal appearance. She did not know, and would not accept when told, that courage was giving her a degree of triumph. Her concept of an inimical world found some justification in the authorities' new and tighter regulations, arbitrary as a computer, concerning drug addicts. Racked with pain from a spinal disease, she, a seasoned addict well known at the Home Office, was compelled to attend an appointed centre at regular periods for a session which to her was futile. Fear that her supply of drugs would be withheld forced her on the journeys. She saw it all as disciplinary punishment. Her bazooka was their torpedo. Taxi drivers were compassionate, bearing her to and from the pilgrimage. She returned to these stories, a valid discipline, and their clarity of style, their spurning of sensationalism, and their own code of logic were another justification of her vision. That was the introduction to Anna Kavan, Julia and the Bazooka, introduction written by Rhys Davies.
Thank you, Alan. You can probably gather just by that small introduction that we are dealing with a very unique individual. Now, Anna Kavan was never one for self-pity. She knew her addiction, she knew all about her weaknesses. She was rather like Virginia Woolf, who likewise knew about her illness. She knew where that her own illness stems from. But both writers were not into any form of self-pity. On the contrary, they were artists. In Anna Kavan's case, she was an artist working through addiction. So over the next couple of weeks we'll be touching upon this idea of what is addiction, where does it come from, where does it stem from. Anna Kavan, as Alan mentioned, one of her outstanding observations is the book Asylum Piece, which in America is still held up as a masterpiece. I don't like using that word actually, but it's probably true. So we're exploring this idea of normality and madness. I don't think Anna Kavan would have liked that distinction, but her work is at its best is absolutely terrifying. And it probably, the more you go into her work, the more you can begin to probably touch that almost invisibility of what makes an individual an addict. And why does the addict turn inward in order to search for a deeper meaning of their pain, their hurt, and their alienation from society? Because I think that an addict is an individual who is basically an outcast from society. They're not criminals, although it's a criminal offence now at the moment, but we'll come on to that another time, about the criminality of addiction and drugs. But yeah, so Anna Kavan is unique and dangerous as well. But she doesn't, unlike some writers who write about addiction and drugs, I'm thinking now of William Burroughs. Burroughs can overemphasise the danger and the excitement of addiction, the streetwise hustlers and what have you. Anna Kavan was not part of that scene. She was an addict who was trapped in a particular world that she was never ever afraid of looking into and writing about it.
Let's have a
read one bit from Asylum, please.
Yeah, okay. Okay, I'm going to look at a couple of pieces. Yeah, well, okay, but I've got a couple of pieces marked out, but I'm going to read just the one. I think I'm going to read this one actually. This part is page 199. Yeah, and it's hang on, page 209. Page 209. There is no end. Whither shall I go from thy spirit? Whither shall I flee from thy presence? If I ascend into heaven, thou art there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, thou art there. If I take the wings of the morning, even there thy hand shall lead me. I can't think properly these days. I find it difficult to remember, but I suppose those words were written about Jehovah, though they apply just as well to my enemy, if that is what I should call him. If I make my bed in hell, behold, thou art there. That particular phrase rings in my brain with a horrid aptness, for certainly I have made my bed in hell, and certainly he is here with me. He is near all the time, although I do not see him. Only sometimes, very early in the morning, before it has got light, I seem to catch a glimpse of a half-familiar face peering in at the window, but it is always snatched away so quickly that I have no time to recognize it. And just once, one evening, the door of my room was suddenly opened a little way, and somebody glanced in through the crack, and then passed hurriedly out of sight down the corridor. Perhaps that was he. Why does he keep his eye on me like this now that he has accomplished his purpose and brought about my destruction? It can't be to make sure that I don't escape. Oh no, there's no possibility of that. He needs not have the slightest fear. Is it just to gloat over my ruin? But no, I don't think that's the reason either. For if that were so, he would come more often, and at times more humiliating to me when I am in the deepest despair. Somehow I have the impression, from those vague glimpses I have caught of his face, that it wears a look that is not vindictive, but kindred, almost as though he were related closely to me by some similarity of brain or blood. And of late the idea has come to me, fantastic enough I admit, that possibly after all he is not my personal enemy, but a sort of projection of myself, an identification of myself with the cruelty and destructiveness of the world. On a planet where there is so much natural conflict, may there not very well exist in certain individuals an overwhelming affinity with frustration and death? and may this not result in an actual materialization, a sort of eidolon moving about the world. I have thought a lot about such matters of late, sitting here and looking out of the window. For, strangely enough, there are windows without bars in this place, and doors which are not even locked. Apparently there is nothing to prevent me from walking out whenever I feel inclined. Yet though there is no visible barrier, I know only too well that I am surrounded by unseen and impassable walls, which tower into the highest domes of the zenith and sink many miles below the surface of the earth. So it has come upon me, the doom too long awaited, the end without end, the bannerless triumph of the enemy who, after all, appears to be close as a brother. Already it seems to me that I have spent a lifetime in this narrow room, whose walls will continue to regard me with secrecy through innumerable lifetimes to come. Is it life then, or death, stretching like an uncoloured stream behind and in front of me? There is no love here, nor hate, nor any point where feeling accumulates. In this nameless place nothing appears animate, nothing is close, nothing is real. I am pursued by the remembered scent of dust sprinkled with summer rain. Outside my window there is a garden where nobody ever walks, a garden without seasons, for the trees are all evergreens. At certain times of the day I can hear the clatter of footsteps on the concrete-covered ways which intersect the lawns. But the garden is always deserted, set for the casual appreciation of strangers, or else for the remote and solitary contemplation of eyes defeated like mine. In this impersonal garden, all neatness and vacancy, there is no arbour where friends could linger, but only concrete paths along which people walk hurriedly, inattentive to the singing of birds.
Thank you. Now, that gives, I think, some idea of the enclosure of an asylum. We don't have asylums now. We have different asylums. I think we have different asylums called drugs, medication. But one thing about Anna Kavan is, if you didn't know her, you would see her as a very, very attractive, very slim, extremely well-dressed individual. Probably stood out in a crowd, but nobody would know that she was, to use that phraseology, a junkie. Anna Kavan was a drug addict, but people could look at her who didn't know her and would have no clue that it was this well-dressed woman who would go to all the best places in London, notably the Cafe Royale and various high-class clubs. Nobody knew, because of her appearance, what was going on. Here was this woman who was just a wealthy-looking individual having a very pleasant time on a Sunday afternoon or a Saturday afternoon in the sun somewhere, drinking fine wine, having a conversation with somebody. But there was a civil war going on in her mind. And I know from personal experience about addiction, and you never escape from that civil war that is going on in your mind. So you begin to develop other personalities, which I think we all do anyway. We all develop sort of to impress people or to be left alone. But Anna Kavan did change not only her name, she got rid of her husband, her wedding maiden name, but with that came a sense of what she can write. It was a sense of creativity, and one of the influences on Kavan was Kafka, Franz Kafka. And there's some debate about whether she called herself Kavan because it had a link to Kafka. I don't think that matters, but it certainly stimulated a move into surrealism, into a dream world, into something quite frightening, where normality doesn't exist. It can never exist for the addict. That's one of the things. And the thing about addiction, it's always there. It's always lurking in the background. So you become very aware of your own actions, very aware of, hyper aware of other people, what they might be thinking of you, which they might not. So it's a form of paranoia as well. And that runs through Kavan's work. And I think it's important that when we start talking about addicts and drugs, we have to see the person and not the image. It's the person that we have to see. And usually normality hides behind madness and criminality. Kavan and artists like Kavan who were addicted were never criminals. Now, as Alan read out, she did attempt suicide a few times. She was hospitalised a hell of a lot of times, but she always came back, not just to her bazooka, but also to her everyday life. I mean, she was a noted interior designer. She designed her own flat, her own house and garden. And she argued with architects and builders. They did not know that this well-spoken, upper middle class woman was a junkie who was going through hell, but she kept it to herself. And I think how we judge people, particularly today in this weird culture where lies become truth and truth becomes lies, where that old sort of idea of celebrity holds sway, that we won't desire that we can never obtain. Artists like Kavan would turn their backs on that. That was what she was on about when she writes. The world that we live in is a very nasty place, and it holds terrors, and a lot of those terrors go back into childhood. It goes back into rejection. It goes into childhood paranoia, childhood depression, and it feeds. It's those. They are the beginnings that move an individual, not all individuals, but in certain individuals, into and onto the path of addiction. And I'm going to say again, addiction is not a criminal act at all. There are criminals out there who are normal. And we have to begin to argue the whole sense of normality. And as this whole process that we're discovering over the next weeks, maybe months, we have a pharmaceutical industry that is geared solely to making a depressed person, a manic depressed person, or any other person with a so-called mental illness, to make them better. And that to me is an affront on dignity, because the pharmaceutical industry will define an individual and will prescribe what type of clinical drug they're going to take. When I repeat, right out there, there's normality walking the streets with a dagger behind their backs. Alan?
Well, we're kind of talking, we're moving away a little bit from Anna Kavan now. We've also, Alphie and I, been consulting the work of an author on madness called Darian Leader. And he's published some very interesting material on this subject, and I'm going to check out a little bit of it now. He argues that kind of madness is really more everyday than I think a lot of people would like to admit, and I think that kind of aspect of it is genuinely fascinating, and it's the fact that it's everyday thing, and that delusions are what we understand as delusions, false ideas, are not symptoms of madness or distress, but a response to madness and distress. And I think that he argues about a quiet madness, how madness can live in people for years without anything seeming to trigger it or anything happening that would make the madness express itself in a kind of a public way, through violence or through some kind of exhibitionistic display or anything like that. And it's and almost arguing in a way that people sometimes come to depend, almost come to survive through reliance on what are, on closer inspection, false beliefs. So why do they hold these beliefs, and what sort of effects they have? I mean, and he discusses a couple of things here. I'm going to look at here. This is page. This is from Psychosis, chapter Psychosis in the book What is Madness. He describes that paranoid delusions are different from paranoid ideas. In paranoia, self and the other are strictly separated, but the schizophrenic's paranoid thoughts may well blur this boundary. The other is present within themselves, as if a total separation is not possible. A schizophrenic may believe that their thoughts and even feelings are not their own, but somehow put there from the outside, or even the experiences of someone else. The paranoiac, on the contrary, sees external forces as acting outside them, not inside them, and there is never the idea that their thoughts have been stolen from their mind or inserted. The split between self and other is thus maintained, which means that the paranoiac is fundamentally innocent. It is always the fault of others, be it the neighbour, the CIA, or the state. In melancholia, on the contrary, it is always the subject's fault. Despite counter-argument and even legal exoneration, the person believes with delusional conviction that they have done something wrong. This tort can be identified with a misdemeanor or neglect in their conduct, but ultimately concerns their very being, the core of their existence, which is judged harshly and mercilessly. The self is irredeemably guilty, and nothing can be done about this. The meaning is fixed. They may besiege their entourage with a litany of self-reproach, and if a therapist tries to persuade them that things are not their fault, or if they are found innocent of some charge by a court, they may endanger themselves and at times others to prove their sin. So you've got an example of here of how madness can affect you in kind of like almost in an everyday way, where you can live your life believing you are being persecuted by others, or you can believe that you are guilty of something which you are not guilty of, or believe you are something you're not. I mean, for me, talking about my own experience here, I always think that delusions can cut both ways. I think that delusions can make you think that you're better than you are, but by that same token, can also make you think that you are worse than you are. The need for a kind of a proper balanced assessment of yourself, it's very difficult to maintain when you're kind of beset with anxiety and depression because of these forces inside you, that you're projecting either onto yourself or onto the world at large. I should point out, sometimes delusions can make you feel both lesser than you are and better than you are at the same time. I am lesser than this, therefore I am greater than this. You know, it's funny and almost twisted the way the way the mind can can stimulate and be able to sustain itself, and the kind of ideas that we have about ourselves and the world. And if any of you kind of listening to this might remember the movie Psycho by Alfred Hitchcock, and which is of course about the psychotic, which is about the murderer Norman Bates. Now, Norman Bates, it later emerges, before the kind of events in the movie, has been living with his own delusions for years. And the kind of like the drama comes when something offsets that, something disturbs his delusions. He has created a delusional reality for himself in his house and the motel which he runs, which he has done to suppress a guilt he feels over the death of his mother. And it's only when that is disturbed that he reacts in a violent way. But the point of what I'm saying is that up until, it's a fictional story, until the events of that movie, Norman, as we're led to believe, persisted with this delusion for years without any real, outward or public displays of disturbance at all. Most people encountering him would not have thought there was seriously wrong with him, would have thought there was anything seriously wrong with him until the events of the movie. And that, although this is fiction, it parallels most experiences of madness, and that you can encounter mad, people who are what we would call mad. You can encounter them on the street and not believe there was anything wrong with them until something is done or something is said to them that challenges the false beliefs on which they have based their lives. And that's when you get the kind of reactions that you get. But most of the time, this doesn't happen, and people can continue through their lives with false beliefs without displaying them in a public or violently dangerous way. And this kind of pulls us on to what we're talking about, and the way that kind of go into a kind of a real life example of psychosis here. In the case of the murderer, Harold Shipman. Now, he talks about this, Darian Leader talks about this. I want to read this out again. Now, Leader explains, madness and normality are no better equated than in the case of Britain's most prolific murderer. Harold Shipman went about his business for decades before arousing suspicion, and yet his good citizenship and modest life were combined with unbridled homicide. Although there is some disagreement about the number of his victims, he killed at least 250 people, and very probably many more. Despite this unparalleled and extraordinary murderous passion, in Shipman's case there was no violent outburst, no socially inappropriate behaviour, no noisy delusional system that he felt compelled to broadcast. In fact, when Shipman was interviewed by psychiatrists, they found no indications of mental illness. Rather than taking this verdict seriously, why not recognise once again that madness must not be identified with its visible manifestations? The signs of madness may be, and usually are, highly discreet. Madness and normal life are compatible rather than opposed in most, though not all, instances. Shipman's story is fascinating not only as a case study in quiet madness, but also in what it shows us about how society responds to questions of madness and murder. When I organised a conference a few years ago on Shipman, I received letters from elderly people who insisted that if Shipman were alive and practising, they would have no hesitation in seeking him out as their GP. This was well after the trial and Dame Janet Smith's Shipman inquiry, which had found him guilty of more than 200 murders. Now that is remarkable if you think about it. The fact that this man, in spite of what he has done, could still be perceived by so many as normal, and could still pass himself off as could still hide his activities under murderous activities under his facade is, in a horrific way, quite remarkable. And wouldn't you agree with that one? I mean, it's incredible.
Oh yeah, I mean, this is this goes into on a deeper level what Darren Leader is about, and what we've been touching upon. It's that old age thing that we talk about, what is normal, but it goes beyond that. There's also a sense of power involved in that, in Shipman's case, over his victims. He became God. He had control over life and death. Because we don't know how many victims that he actually did not kill of his patients. So there was a practicing doctor who was respected in his profession, who probably had a belief in his own power, his own omnipotence over life and death. He could choose. You'll live today, but I might kill you tomorrow. I think it was that's not simple, because it goes into other areas, doesn't it? For like omnipotence. What is that? It's an authority. It's a powerful authority. But going back to Shipman again, when Alan was reading, I began to sort of think about Anna Kavan, a love of the Bible. She actually loved the Bible, and that does come through in some of her work. This sort of, the apocalypse can be quite beautiful. Images that she creates, particularly in one story about the birth of a new star. So with Shipman, is he that omnipotent that he thinks he's God? Because he does have the power of life and death. He's got the medical background. He's got access to all the medical accolades that he wants. So he is playing God, but he's normal.
Yeah, well, I think if going on further, I think because of his position and because of the majority of his victims were older people who were on medication. I think he might have rationalised it to himself that he was doing the right thing for them by killing them.
What I mean. He was coming out and thinking,
I don't think it was. I wouldn't say it was as grandiose as saying I am God. It's just I am the doctor, and I believe it is better to kill these people than to let them live. And it's as simple as that. That's his rationalisation.
Is that the same now?
When people think they're God, I mean, that's a kind of a grandiose thing. I'm talking about this is more banal. I mean, but that's what makes it chilling. That is what makes it that's what makes it horrifying. Is basically the banality of his motivation, the simplicity of it.
It's his profession.
Yeah, exactly.
It gives him that ability. I mean, this goes on to what we were touching upon much earlier, around the death camps and Nazism. The banality. Yeah, and Alan's upon that point. Maybe there was on his part this medical knowledge that it was, these people, his patients, who trusted him. They probably outlived their time. Maybe it would be better off if they are dead. Would that come into it?
Yeah, that's what you think. Yeah, that's what he was thinking. It's better
because
off.
It is. I mean, when we get into something like Shipman, this is where which Leader goes on about all the time, isn't it? Mm-hmm. This ambiguity of the medical profession. He goes, of titles, of definitions, particularly about around what I term manic depression, which is now goes under the title of bipolar. And I mean, go back to Anna Kavan for a second. She goes on about this quite a lot. The authority. Who's got the authority over? And are we paranoid if we start thinking about authority out there? And Shipman was part of an authoritative medical practice. And this is where it comes into madness. You know, no one would have taken a blind bit of notice of Shipman in the street. No one. On the bus, on the underground, in a restaurant, in a bar, anywhere. Very mundane life probably. I don't know much about his actual life outside his profession. But how many did he kill?
Over 250.
Yeah. With drugs to put people to sleep.
Yep. Used usually via, just kind of like drug injection or overdose.
And was there anything that triggered it?
Well, I mean, they're looking into it. I mean, he had some kind of unresolved family drama. I think
There you go. Don't do it now. I think it's something we can talk about later.
Yeah,
Not
cool.
now, but later.
All right.
Because it's the same with a lot of these. What triggers something that has been dormant? And as Alan said, I think we trace it back to childhood. I think we trace it back to childhood trauma that is suppressed, deeply, suppressed, which then breaks out into the sort of the surrounding environment, how you're brought up, what streets you live in, blah blah blah, and all that, the sociological aspects of it. But it goes back to childhood. It goes back to childhood trauma. Most children can survive a hell of a lot of trauma, but there's other children who can't survive trauma. They suppress it, but something triggers it later into something like Shipman. How many of them are out there is the question, isn't it? And that's the landscape, I think, that Anna Kavan explores. Although she talks about the apocalypse quite a lot, and the dream time, and what have you. What one finds with Anna Kavan is there's always at the back of all her writing, there is a violence. You can't escape the fact that there is a violence there. It's almost a sadomasochistic violence, which is traced right back to her childhood. Relationships with men is very sadomasochistic. And remember that her father committed suicide. She was moved around by her mother something like about 17 times from country to country, which we would say, well travelled. No, she was deeply disturbed from a very, very early age. But she admits it. That's what she's exploring. Shipman and people like him never admit to that trauma. They've suppressed it so much that it doesn't exist until something triggers it. I think. Is that?
Yeah, it ties into what we've been talking about for the past 20 minutes, indeed.
Right, shall we?
Yeah.
So we'll carry on in this.
Carry on in this vein in a couple of weeks, but yep. Thank you for listening. I've been Alan English, and this is Alfie Pritchard. So.
Thank you very much. I think that we're hitting upon something. Also, what Leader does, is very, very, very angry with the pharmaceutical industry, and he's very angry at the political motivation behind the so-called mental health professionals. That's what I find about his writing as well. This idea that one pill makes you happy, and that pill makes you go to sleep. And on that happy note, That is from.
All right, okay. Thank you very much, folks. See you
Back
next time.
in a couple of weeks' time.
Yep, see you next time.
Not bad, was it? Ah. Cheers, Freddie.